Hey Dragon Slayers! Today's video is about over and underweight babies, as well as a paternal connection to insulin resistance. So, over and underweight babies being born on either end of the weight spectrum can have consequences later in life. And having a mother with hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance has a surprisingly strong influence on this. Before we go on, I want to clarify that when I refer to a newborn's weight in this section, I don't mean a baby that is naturally smaller or bigger because of family genetics. I am discussing the situation when all things are considered and a baby is born smaller or larger than anticipated. A mother's metabolic health and the health of her baby are closely connected. Some of the strongest evidence of this comes from the Dutch Famine Study, which tracked the health of people who were conceived during the Dutch famine of 1944 through 1945 at the end of World War II. Researchers were able to explore the effects of the famine that it had on these individuals depending on whether it had occurred early, late, or in the middle of the mother's pregnancy. Individuals whose mothers endured famine at the beginning of pregnancy were significantly more likely to be obese later in life, compared with normal. Importantly, these observations weren't necessarily associated with the infant being born larger or smaller than normal. It was independent of newborn body weight. As you'll see later on, obesity and insulin resistance are closely connected. For a mother with more dramatic pregnancy insulin resistance, such as maternal gestational diabetes or polycystic ovarian syndrome, the most common result is that the infant is born with a higher birth weight than normal. The fetus has developed an insulin and possibly glucose rich environment, thriving beyond what is normally typical. This may seem benign, but it has long lasting effects. These infants are roughly 40% more likely to be obese and have metabolic complications in their teenage years and beyond. On the other end of the spectrum are infants born below the normal and expected birth weight, common when the mother develops preeclampsia, as we discovered in a previous video. It might be tempting to assume that any child with a high birth weight is much more likely to become obese and insulin resistant than a normal birth weight baby, and certainly more than a low birth weight baby. But it's not so simple. While individuals with a high birth weight do indeed have an increased likelihood of obesity and insulin resistance later in childhood, the risk is actually greater in those with a low birth weight. Paradoxically, just like the high birth weight infants, these children are more likely than average to develop obesity and metabolic disorders later in life. The metabolic complications of low birth weight have been particularly well documented in the UK, where the researchers have consistently observed that children born thin don't stay that way for long. And yes, it's true. Infants born below the normal weight are the most likely to become obese and insulin resistant. This trend can start to appear as early as 4 years old, and by this age, the child has often caught up to normal weight peers and begins to surpass them in weight. Though it can appear later in teenage years, as well as last into late adulthood, a part of this effect may be related to the physical stress of being born low birth weight and potentially confounding events surrounding the birth. We'll look at the how stress connects to insulin resistance in a later video. What about the child's father? There's overwhelming majority of research on neonatal metabolic complications has focused on the role of the mother's insulin metabolic health. The relatively smaller focus on the father's insulin and metabolic health has yielded conflicting results. However, studies that track and explore insulin resistance and other metabolic parameters of the offspring, not just birth weight, support the idea that paternal insulin resistance matters. If dad has insulin resistance, it's one more trait the baby might inherit. So that's what I've got for you guys today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, guys. And remember that together, you and I will slay the dreaded diabetes dragon.